It's a pleasure to be in Oslo. I flew here yesterday from Washington, where I was talking to the State Department about these issues. And I've been talking in the last 2 months to a number of governments, and especially military-related and conflict-related groups, about the Kenyan invasion. It is very shocking to me when doing that they understand so little about the refugee and humanitarian aspects of this war, and that so little attention is given to those issues. And I hope to come back to that in what I have to say this afternoon. Thank you very much for tolerating me presenting in English. I can assure you, if you came to Oxford, we wouldn't want you to present in Norwegian, so I appreciate warmly being able to do so. I should explain perhaps that I'm a historian by training, not a political scientist, and I think that will become apparent in some of the ways that I analyze the material. But I have a chair of politics, so I have to pretend to be a political scientist, so I'm doing my best. I should also say I'm not an expert in refugee or migration studies. We have one here on the panel, very fortunately, who can keep us all right. But I do want to emphasize the importance in this context of Kenya's invasion of Somalia of linking up the refugee and humanitarian issues to the geopolitics and the conflict issues. And the more we can all do to make that happen, the better. So let me begin. October 16th, 2011, Kenya's armed forces invaded southern Somalia, seemingly without any advance notice to anyone. They did so in the midst of a regional famine. Not just any famine, but the worst famine this region has seen for nearly 30 years. Why they chose to do so at that time, and what their purpose was, are things open to debate and discussion. Al-Shabaab can't supply itself nearly as easily in the range. So this map shows the invasion from the Kenyans. 1 battalion from Liboy, a second from Ras Kamboni, and a third, much less well publicized, from El Wak. Now, most of the journalists mistakenly think the Kenyans are going this way, to Afmado and then down to Kismayu. What they're in fact trying to do is to take Afmado, which is on the river Juba, and seal off that crossing, and then move to Jalib. And Jalib's on the river Shebele and on the road to Mogadishu. So what they're attempting to do is encircle and cut off Kismayu and then move in on the city. So they've not been going directly to Kismayu. They'll save that until they cross off. They've not yet got much beyond Afmada, because Al-Shabaab basically dug in, defended very well. They have battlements built at Jubil, they have tunnels at Jubil, they have a whole complex at Jubil. So it's going to be a difficult campaign. But that's what they're trying to do. The Ethiopians, in the meantime, a few weeks into this, although they didn't at the time consult directly with the Kenyans, also invaded. And they came in here and they headed down to Baidoa. Now this was in fact just the admission of a long-standing Ethiopian policy, whereby in Bakul and in Gedo, northern Gedo, they have been funding militia groups who are opposed to Al-Shabaab. They've been doing so covertly. And those militia groups have been trying to hold the whole area here to prevent Shabaab pushing up to the north and to the Ogaden border. So the Ethiopians' attempt is to split links between the Ogaden and Al-Shabaab, so that the Al-Shabaab forces don't support the ONLF forces and other forces in the Ethiopian area. That appears to have been fairly successful. There's now at least 2 Ethiopian battalions at Baidoa, and if they haven't taken it already, I think they probably will take the town fairly soon. And what that does is that basically it strangles Al-Shabaab into an area south of where my pointer is. And that's the aim, to stop them getting back north if the Kenyans and their allies eventually push them out. So that's the military objectives. What about the political side of this? Well, that's a picture showing some of the Somali leaders with Kenya's foreign minister, all smiles and bonhomie. But this was taken some 3 or 4 days after the invasion began. Because when it began, it appeared that some of the gentlemen in this photograph didn't know it was beginning. From the best information we can gather, the invasion was not discussed by the Kenyan cabinet. The decision was taken by a small coterie around the president and the military. And the military had a very loud voice, I believe, in what happened. And for those of you who know about Kenya, that's quite a worrying development, because until fairly recently, the Kenyan military has not been particularly overt in politics. And I think what this invasion partly should warn us against is that Kenya's military now has a strong voice in politics, and that might prove quite decisive as we move ahead. From the Somali side, these gentlemen represent the TFG, the Transitional Federal Government in Mogadishu, many of whom actually live and reside in Nairobi. Now, that government has been very ineffective over the years and hasn't really achieved much it was intended to achieve. But the strategy of the regional group IGAD, which is the East African Federation of countries, it's the equivalent of ECOWAS and SADC, the approach of IGAD has been to try and argue against a multiple Somali solution. IGAD doesn't want there to be 5 Somalias all applying to join, all as Islamist states, which is their nightmare scenario. They want one Somalia, one voice, one vote only. So they are doing their level best to try and prevent a multiple Somaliland solution. So if you've been wondering why the international community is slow to acknowledge the existence of Somaliland in the north, the real reason is that the regional states will not support it. And international countries in Europe and in North America will not, they feel too exposed to acknowledge Somaliland, while those in the region will not. So one can see the invasion of southern Somaliland partly as an IGAD initiative. And in fact, if one looks back over the reporting of IGAD presidents' meetings, of some of the papers available to us thanks to WikiLeaks, you can get quite a clear picture that IGAD has been discussing this problem in depth for the last 2 years, and that the invasion was not a spontaneous act just by the Kenyans. It was well planned and well organized. The Kenyans have been being trained by the Americans since 2009. They recruited a Somali-speaking battalion of 2,500 men from within Kenya, who they trained as Ranger-style forces. And the idea was an old-fashioned American tactic that's been used elsewhere, which would be to put a third force, an infiltration force, into southern Somalia to work with local militias to destabilize al-Shabaab. So the Kenyans had trained men already who were in southern Somalia before the invasion, one group at Ras Kamboni, the other group in the central area, who were working with rebel militias against al-Shabaab. And the Americans have been training for that, the British have been involved in it as well. It's been quite a well-known tactic. The Kenyans have even gone so far as to suggest that this part of southern Somaliland, Somalia rather, known as Jubaland, ought to have its independence, in inverted commas. And they've even suggested that a constitution should be drafted for its government, and that one of their militia heads should be the leader of that government. He happens to be a French anthropologist who is known by the name of Gandhi. Confusing, but that's the situation. So you can see that Kenyans have done a lot of thinking about what this might look like. Now, I do not believe that that's been done unilaterally. And I know there have been back-channel discussions between the Kenyans and the Ethiopians about what the future of this area should be. Now, that doesn't mean the Kenyans and the Ethiopians agree. They do not. They have some very divergent ideas about what the future should look like. But both have a vested interest in recreating a weak Somalia that they can control. And that, I think, is their principal aim. They don't want a strong Somalia on their border with an army that looks threatening. They want a federated Somalia of little weak parts, some of which on the borders they control and manipulate. Now, I'll leave it to the discussion for us to ask whether that's in the interests of Somalia and whether Somalis will like that or not. I suspect I know the answer. But let's come to that in the discussion. So I think the point I'm trying to get across is I don't think we should see this invasion as a spontaneous act. It's part of a program of activities. And if you think about it that way, you can see that the famine and the refugee crisis presented an opportunity. And the excuse for that opportunity was the apparent seizure of hostages, allegedly by Al-Shabaab. You remember 2 British tourists were captured and 1 shot. In September, a French tourist was taken, and 2 Spanish workers for MSF were kidnapped from Dadaab camp. Now, there's actually, I've seen a little bit of evidence now that at least 1 set of those hostages got traded on to an Al-Shabaab militia later. But there is no direct evidence that Al-Shabaab took any of those hostages. And indeed, Al-Shabaab made statements denying involvement in these events from the start. And Al-Shabaab had good reasons not to take hostages, because it gets its revenue flows from other areas, and it doesn't want to be entangled with the piracy issue. But of course, as Al-Shabaab has become under more pressure and is more pressurized, involvement with that kind of activity becomes more likely. But back in September, I don't think Al-Shabaab did these things, but every announcement by the Kenyan government said that they did. And when Kenyan government officials were asked repeatedly to give the evidence, they said they couldn't. There was none. But the fact that Al-Shabaab was alleged to have done these things justified the invasion. It was a very useful excuse. And the military spokespersons repeated this again and again. This is the Kenyan Chief of Staff and his main advisors. And here is the wonderful Manuel Chirchir, who is the Kenyan spokesperson. He's the guy who tweeted the 10 towns they were about to invade, causing a massive exodus of people. How stupid can you get? And here's that slightly more sinister photograph. Managed to get hold of this one from various sources. These are the American Rangers who've been training the Kenyan forces for the last 2 years at Isiolo, and also sometimes using the camp down in Manyani and on the British facility up at Archer's Post, which is now Britain's largest and most important overseas training base. I wonder why Britain wants to keep this stable. And there's the Kenyan Navy. Because behind this whole story is the piracy question. Lots of European governments are interested in this situation because they feel that the instability of Somalia generally, its statelessness, is the cause of the piracy problem. Therefore, they make a connection between getting rid of Al-Shabaab, taking the port of Kismayu, and that will help to solve the piracy problem. It will not. The two things are not necessarily related. They might have some links, but there's no cause and effect. Al-Shabaab are not pirates. Pirates are not Al-Shabaab. But it's very alarming when I go around talking to policy people that that is not understood. There is an assumption that this will solve the piracy problem. It will not. It's driven by different things. Also, that assumption is based on the idea that if the Kenyans get control of Kismayu, everything will be just fine. I beg to differ. The Kenyans and the Ethiopians disagree enormously on how Kismayu should be governed and administered. Kismayu is an extremely difficult place to defend, and the Kenyans will find it very costly in terms of body bags. B, it's a very divided area. It's not obvious which clan and which group should run Kismayu. Unless they make a very careful allocation of resources around Kismayu, everybody will be sniping at them. The Kenyan army want to be rehatted in Kismayu as a peacekeeping force as part of AMISOM. Now, this raises, and I'm going to finish in this in the last couple of points, but this raises some other difficulties. Some of you may know that AMISOM was set up as a peacekeeping movement supported by the AU under a United Nations statute to go in to Mogadishu to hold the peace. Well, last summer, Museveni, whose Ugandan forces formed the major part of AMISOM, basically threw away that agreement and turned AMISOM into a counterinsurgency campaign. Now that should worry us for several reasons. Firstly, AMISOM is paid for by us, by the West. These African armies cannot fund it themselves. Part of the reason why they get involved is to paid by us to do it. We paid for a peacekeeping mission. We now have a counterinsurgency war that we are effectively funding. Now that may be a good thing in the sense that the outcome might be a positive one for Somalia. Al-Shabaab being pushed out of Mogadishu is certainly a positive outcome. I wouldn't argue with that at all. But the way in which this peacekeeping mission has morphed into a counterinsurgency campaign is really quite troubling for the status of international law. The Kenyans are now arguing that they should be rehatted as part of that peacekeeping mission. So we pay for their invasion too. It's costing them around $180 million a month. Even Kenya can't afford that. So they need to be rehatted to get someone else to pay for the cost of the munition. Now, if the Kenyans were rehatted and put in charge of Kismayo, that wouldn't be the end of the problem. Because the Kenyan army has no real supply and logistics, so it predates off the land. So as soon as the Kenyans are situated in Kismayo, they will need to be supplied. And that will affect the entire local economy, and there'll be trouble. And if you want a parallel, just think of what happened when the Ugandans and Rwandans went into Eastern Congo. The same kind of situation, where they will have to create local militias in order to survive themselves in the situation they're in, because they'll need to protect their procurement. So I think the taking of Kismayo is only the beginning of another kind of problem. And then to conclude, a last comment. What about those refugees that we started with? Where do they end up out of all this? What's their situation going to be? Well, probably no different and probably quite a lot worse. Because the militarization of the whole border zone has made the administration of those refugee camps much worse. The idea that refugee flows will be stopped by the invasion is demonstrably false. We can show by the figures of the last few months that the invasion has in fact generated more movement, not less, despite the fact the famine is easing, not getting worse. So the invasion itself is becoming a cause of humanitarian crisis. Will southern Somalia under Kenyan rule be any more stable and any more likely to deliver aid to these people? I'm not sure. I'd need some convincing. But if that is not the outcome, the status of ordinary people and of refugees in this area is certainly going to be no better, and I think I would argue it will be a good deal worse. I don't think the militarization of the area by the Kenyans is going to help. Will the Kenyans actually get rid of Al-Shabaab? No. Al-Shabaab will not be got rid of. It will disappear and re-emerge somewhere else. And eventually, some kind of settlement has to be made with the groups that make up Al-Shabaab. Now, I agree with the analysts who say that the current leadership of Al-Shabaab is difficult to talk to for all kinds of good reasons. But Al-Shabaab is made up of a coalition of many smaller parts. And I think the stripping off of those smaller parts and discussions with them should be a diplomatic tactic that is being employed. And as Al-Shabaab comes under more pressure, that may be possible, and we may find we can reduce its size and its scope. But my best guess is that Al-Shabaab will re-emerge after the Kenyan invasion along the Shabelle Valley or in central Bakul, somewhere else, as a different kind of problem. So diplomatically, we shouldn't imagine we can simply crush it. We have to talk to it. We have to deal with it. Now, what about these guys, the Kenyan and Ethiopian military? Well, they've had a good year. They've done well out of this. Lots of practice for what they do best, lots of extra training, lots of international support. Their position in regional politics has been strengthened. And I think that's one of the worrying things for this region. Uganda, Rwanda, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, they are all post-liberation military governments. They are not democracies. They are autocracies. And they are led by military men who don't balk at military solutions. Has Kenya just moved a step closer to joining that club?